Hi there! For this month's Teen Take and Make kit in York, we're making Fat Bear Feltie keychains. Why? Because it's Fat Bear season. Specifically, it's Fat Bear Week. Or at least it was. Usually Fat Bear Week is the first week in October, but I guess all the bears have an early bedtime this year because it came early. It's not going to stop us from celebrating though. Fat Bear Week celebrates the bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska by having a March Madness style competition where people vote on who they think the fattest bear is. Bears need to store a lot of fat to make it through hibernation, and because of Katmai's strenuous conservation efforts, it is home to the largest population of sockeye salmon in the world. That's how the bears get so fat and why it's worth celebrating. You can read up on the competing bears as well as drop in on the live cameras at Brooks Falls on Katmai's website under the National Park Service. But since we're pretty far away from Alaska, I've made this tutorial on how you can make your very own fat bear. To begin, you will need 2 pieces of brown felt cut into the shape of a bear, a light brown or tan felt oval to serve as the belly, a sort of oblong piece of light brown or tan felt for the face, 2 pieces of pink felt cut into the shape of a fish, 2 pieces of teal felt for the fish head, 2 pieces of teal felt for the fish fins, some brown ribbon, a sewing needle, black thread, brown thread, and pink thread, some polyfill or other stuffing, a couple small plastic doll eyes, a keychain, and scissors. It may also help to use a marker and some strong glue, but it isn't necessary. If you have the kit from the library, this has already been done for you, but the first step is to attach the keychain. Take one of the bear body pieces, the keychain, and the ribbon. If one side of the bear has marker lines around the edges from where it was cut out, work on that side so the lines will be hidden on the inside of the bear. Then I'm going to glue down the ribbon so it pokes out of the top of the bear's head. I'm using super glue because I would prefer not to have stitches showing on the outside of the bear. But if you don't have glue, you can just sew the ribbon in place near the top of the bear's head, somewhere discreet, with some brown thread. Once the ribbon is glued to the felt, run the small ring of the keychain through the ribbon and fold the ribbon over to make a little loop for the keychain. Then glue the ribbon to itself and set it aside to dry. Next, I'm going to make the bear's face. I guess technically it's the muzzle or the snoot or whatever you want to call it, but that's beside the point. I like to place the face piece on what will be the front piece of the bear body to get an idea of the proportions and how large I want the nose to be. Then, I'm going to take my marker and draw a rough version of the nose. This just helps me make sure the nose is centered and the size that I want. You can definitely sew or glue a felt nose here, but since it's so small, I'm just going to embroider one on. But even though the word embroidery sounds fancy, all we're doing is making stitches back and forth right next to each other. Which means it's time to prepare your needle and thread. Get out the black thread and cut off a piece about as long as your arm. Stick one end of the thread through the eye of the needle, match the 2 ends of the thread together, and tie a knot in them. The way I was taught to make a knot is to wrap the ends of the thread around your finger, roll the threads off your finger so they tangle together, and then pull the tangled thread tight until it forms a knot. Sometimes you get a good fat knot right off the bat, and sometimes you have to repeat it to get a knot big enough that it won't pull through the fabric. But when you're done, you're ready to start sewing. You can move the bear body piece to the side. We don't need that anymore, at least not at the moment. Make your first stitch up from the back of the face, or snoot, so the knot will be on the inside, not visible part of the bear. Then make stitches back and forth, as close to each other as you can, to make whatever shaped nose you want. I went with a basic ovalish rectangle here. At this point, it's not important that your edges line up perfectly or anything like that. Just fill in the space with a thread. Then, once the general shape is filled in, you can go back in and fill in any bald spots or run stitches around the nose to make the shape more defined and less like a random blob. With the nose done, it's time to add in the cleft and mouth. Bring your needle up through the bottom center of the nose and make one long stitch down to almost the bottom of the face piece. Then make 2 smaller stitches on either side of that line, like an arrow pointing down, to make the mouth. If you're happy with that, Flip the face piece over and tie a knot in the thread to finish it off. If your lines are crooked or you're just not happy with how it turned out, you can always cut off the thread and pull out the stitches to start over. Felt is a great fabric for this because you can just give it a good rub to erase any previous needle marks. Next, we'll make the belly. This one is a lot simpler. It's exactly 2 stitches. We're just making an X wherever you want the belly button to go. You can use whatever black thread is left over from making the face, or if there's not enough, get a little bit more. I'm not using the marker this time because the thread isn't thick enough to hide it, so I'm just guesstimating where the center is. Sure enough, I estimated wrong and decided to try again. That's a little bit better, or at least good enough for me. So I tied off the thread on the back, and the belly is done. I found it easier to glue the felt pieces in place before I sewed them together so they don't slide around and get off center, but you don't have to. You could also pin them down with a clip or a safety pin just as easily. So I'm going to dab on a small amount in the center of the face and belly before sticking them where I want them. It only needs to be enough to keep the pieces from sliding around. Then I'll leave the glue to dry a little bit while I prepare my thread for the next step. We're moving on from the black thread and onto the brown thread. With my brown thread prepared, I'm now ready to sew the face and belly on, going around the edges using the blanket stitch. For that, you're going to poke the needle up from the back so the knot doesn't show, and through the face just a little ways in. Then run the needle back along the edge of the face piece into the dark brown fabric of the bare body. Be careful with your threads. They like to get caught on every little thing and can get twisted ridiculously easy. But you're going to pull that first stitch tight, then go back in through that first hole you made, or as close to it as you can get. But instead of going back down through the dark brown fabric, you're going to run the needle through the thread of that first stitch and pull it tight. This is how you start a blanket stitch when you're sewing on a patch. From here, stick your needle through the top side of the face piece a little ways over from the first stitch, but don't pull the thread all the way through. Run the needle back up through the dark brown fabric, and you should have this loose thread on the front. It forms a kind of loop as you pull the needle. Run the needle through that loop, and then pull the thread tight. You should now have a little bridge thread going between your 2 stitches along the edge. And that's basically how a blanket stitch works. You just repeat that process all the way around the face piece. I'm going counterclockwise around, but if it's easier, makes more sense to you to go clockwise, do that. It doesn't make a difference. The goal is to keep your stitches roughly the same length and distance apart from each other. Some people will make little marks on the fabric to show them where each stitch should go, but I'm just eyeballing it. You also want to make the lines of your stitches perpendicular to the edge of the face piece, so the edge of the fabric and the stitch create a 90-degree angle. But that can be easier said than done around a curve, so just do your best. Also, because of the curve, that bridge thread running around the edge might pull off the edge. If that happens, just nudge the thread back into place. If it won't go back, or the problem keeps happening, you might be pulling your stitches too tight. Don't get discouraged if your thread gets tangled into a knot or your mind wanders off and you put your needle in when it should have been going out, or whatever the problem ends up being. Like I said before, felt is a very forgiving fabric, so you won't even be able to tell if you have to pull out your stitches and start over again. In fact, I've had to start over twice now on this face piece, but through the magic of editing, it looks like I know what I'm doing. Speaking of, there are many other videos out there that will teach you how to do the blanket stitch, So if my way of explaining it isn't working for you, go watch someone who's been doing it a lot longer than me. And if the blanket stitch is still too frustrating, you can always do the whip stitch instead. I covered the whip stitch in the tutorial for the Yeti Felties, which I'll link below, and it's about as easy as it gets. The blanket stitch is just slightly more decorative looking. With this last stitch, I could just tie it off here, but I kind of want to link the bridge back to the first stitch. And to do that, I'm going to thread my needle through the thread there at the top of the first stitch, and then run the needle down through the dark brown fabric to the back side and tie the thread off there. It doesn't matter if you're not as messy, no one will ever see it. Now that the face is sewn in place, I'll get some more brown thread so that we can do the same for the belly. We're going to sew the belly on the exact same way we did the face. The first stitch goes in through the back of the belly, out through the brown body, and then back in through the same hole in the belly, but this time going through the thread instead of the fabric. And then down through the front of the belly, up through the body, and through the loop of the thread. And around we go. Traditionally, people don't use common sewing thread like this for decorative stitches. They use embroidery thread, which is thicker so it's more noticeable. But embroidery thread is more expensive and requires a lot more work to pull apart the individual threads to get the exact thickness that you want. So we're making do with regular thread. Same as before with the last stitch on the face piece, I'm going to thread my needle through the first stitch first before going down through the brown felt to the back side to tie everything off. And now we have our face and belly. There's just one, well, technically two, things that we need to do to finish up the front side of our bear. Our poor bear is missing half their face, so we should give them some eyes. These things that look like screws are actually doll eyes, and you can get them in a bunch of different sizes. The backs of these are longer than I would like, but when the bear is finished, you won't notice. Essentially, you just poke the eyes through the fabric, but sometimes that's not so easy. The dark brown felt that I have here is pretty stiff and will require more work to punch through. The felt in the kits is softer. Regardless, it might help to use a marker to make a dot where you want the eyes to be. More than once, I have ended up with very lopsided eyes, so I'm definitely going to use all the help I can get. If you can't get the pointy part of the eye through the fabric on its own, you can help it along by pulling your needle all the way through the fabric. This works better with bigger needles. Or you can use scissors to clip the tiniest bit of fabric until you can get the eye through. You just want to be careful that you don't make the hole too big, or else the eye can get loose or even fall out. Then, the eyes come with these suction cup looking things that go on the back of the eye to hold it in place, just like the back of an earring. It's designed to be a snug fit though, so it may take a little oomph to get them in there. Now, with one eye in place, let's do the other one. There we go. Now it actually looks like a bear. There's just one thing missing here on the front. Our fat bear needs a fat fish to hold him through the winter. So we have two sides of a fish, each with a pink body, a head, and a tail. And much like how the bear face and belly needed to be sewn onto the bear's body, we need to do the same for the head and tail of the fish. And at least for me, the first step is dabbing on a little bit of glue to hold the head and tail in place. Just like before, you don't have to do this step, or you can just as easily use a pin or clip to keep them in place. Before the glue dries too much, I'm going to hold the two sides of the fish together to make sure everything lines up. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect because the stitches will disguise some of it, but it helps to make this check to prevent the two sides from looking noticeably askew. But since these two sides match up pretty well, I'm going to move on. There's one more thing I want to do before I sew the heads and tails in place, and that's to trim off some of the extra pink felt. Right now, the green head and tail pieces line up with the pink body, and if we were to sew the two sides together, you would be able to see the pink layer in between the green ones. It kind of ruins the illusion that it's the fish's actual head and not some weird mask that it's wearing. That many layers also gets pretty bulky on something this small. So, to fix that, I'm going to cut away the edges of the pink felt underneath the head and tail. And you'll need to do this on both halves of the fish. You could just cut the pink head and tail straight off, but if you do that, make sure that there's still overlap for when you sew the green pieces onto the pink. Since I glued my green pieces down, I can't cut off all the pink because that would also cut off the part that is glued. You only need to trim away enough so that when you put the two sides of the fish together, you can't see the pink poking through the green. There will be a tiny bit of pink visible at the base of the head and tail where the fabric overlaps, but that will be mostly covered up by our stitches later. Once you've trimmed the extra fat on the fish, it's time for stitching. First, we're going to sew the heads and tails onto the bodies. So put the brown thread aside for the moment and prepare your needle with the pink thread. We're still using the blanket stitch, but instead of going around a shape like the face and belly of the bear, we're going to go straight across the line where the head or tail meets the body. So the first stitch goes in from the back side through the green felt, then out on the edge through the pink felt. Remember to come back in through the same hole as the first time, or close enough to it, and thread the needle through the first stitch. Now go through the front side of the green felt, up through the pink, and hook the needle through the thread loop. And keep working your way across until you reach the other side of the fish. This is pretty simple since it's only a few stitches. Tie the thread off on the back side of the fish. Since I have plenty of thread left on my needle, I'm just going to tie a new knot in the end and repeat the same process on the tail. Now that one half of the fish is done, I'm going to put it aside and do the same thing to the other half. On the first half, my stitches were smaller and weren't as visible as I would have liked, so I'm going to try making them longer on this side to see if they're more noticeable. And with that, now we have two halves of a fish ready to be made whole. I have some more pink thread ready, I have my polyfill stuffing on standby, and I have two sides of a fish. First I'm going to put the two halves together again, backside to backside, to make one last check to see if the lines of the head and tail match up. Also take this moment to decide where you want to add the stuffing. Deciding this now helps determine where you start sewing and prevents you from being stuck stuffing the fish from a more difficult angle. For example, this fish is basically shaped like a cylinder, so it feels more natural to fill it from one of the ends rather than the shallow side. And because I don't want much stuffing in the tail, not that much would fit anyway, I've decided I'm going to stuff the fish from this narrow part at the start of the tail. However, because that opening is so narrow, I'm actually going to start and stop my stitches a little further down so I have enough room to get the polyfill through. Which means I'm going to start about 3/4 of the way up the pink part of the fish, stitch around until about the same spot on the opposite side, and pause there to add the stuffing. Now, the blanket stitch changes a tiny bit when we're sewing up two edges rather than one, but in my opinion it's easier, so don't panic. Except that I immediately forgot the first rule, so excuse me for a moment while I undo the very first thing that I did. Okay, To hide the knot at the end of your thread, first go in from the back side of one side of the fish, so the knot will be tucked away between the two layers. From here, make a stitch over the edges of the fish and come back through that same hole from the other side. Then, go around again, still coming up through that same hole, except instead of pulling the thread tight, you're going to hook your needle through the loop of loose thread and then pull it tight. Now you can move over to your next stitch. Go through one side, and as your needle comes up from the other side, loop through the thread at the top and pull tight. And repeat this all the way around the fish until you come to your designated stopping point. Same as before, try to keep your stitches the same length and the same distance apart from each other. But if you're eyeballing it like me, it's not going to be perfect, and that's just fine. When you get to the parts where the green and pink felt overlap, pay a little extra attention to pulling the stitch tight in order to tuck the pink in between the green, or place the stitch just right to hide it. I'm coming up to my stopping point where I'm going to add the stuffing, but I don't think I have enough thread left to finish stitching around the fin, so I'm going to go ahead and tie off my thread here. For that, I'm going to loop around the stitch I just made and tie a knot at the edge here. I haven't worked out a good way to hide these knots, so I'm just going to try to make it as small as possible and tuck it in between the two layers of fabric as best I can. Now with that, we have a fish ready for stuffing. So take your polyfill, not all of it, just a little bit, and then stuff it in there. It might help to use a pencil, or in my case scissors, to push it down to the bottom. This part always reminds me of the chef in The Little Mermaid when he's singing Les Poissons and stuffing the crabs, except this is a salmon, not a crab. Anyway, just keep adding in the stuffing a little bit at a time until you're happy with how plump and squishy it is. Because fins don't typically have much meat to them, I'm only filling the fish up to this point. Now to sew up the rest of the outside, which for me means getting more thread. Then I'll pick up where I left off and continue to stitch around the fin until I get back to where I started. I haven't quite figured out the best way to work around corners, so I just do the same thing that I have been doing and hope for the best. So far I haven't gotten any catastrophic results. Then, when I'm back to my starting point, I'm going to loop my needle through the first stitch and tie my thread off there. Once again, I don't have a good way to hide this knot, but it's small and won't be super noticeable. But for good measure, I'll try to stuff it down there anyway. And there we have a finished fish. There's only one thing left to do with it, and that's to give it to our bear. So bring out the front side of your bear again so we can sew the fish onto the paw. We're doing this now before we sew on the back of the bear, because it's a lot easier and less clunky. Also, doing it this way, it doesn't matter what color thread you use, because no one is going to see it. I have plenty of leftover pink thread, so I'm going to use that. To hide the knot at the end of the thread, I'm going to go in through the back side of the bear, through the middle of the paw, and scoop up a good chunk of the fish. Just make sure that you don't go all the way through the fish so the thread shows on the other side. Then bring the needle back through the paw and repeat. Keep stitching the fish to the paw until it feels securely fastened, not droopy or flimsy enough to be ripped off the first time it bumps into anything. Also try to keep the stitches localized to the center of the paw, or at least away from the edges of the bear, so they don't get in the way when you sew up the bear later. When you're satisfied the bear isn't going to drop their fish, tie off the thread on the back side of the bear. Now the front of your bear is completely finished. They have a snoot, they have eyes, they have a belly, and they have a fish. So the only thing left to do is sew the front of the bear to the back of the bear. Just like we sewed up the fish, we're going to put the back sides of the bear together and do the blanket stitch all the way around the edge. The fish gets annoying to work around, but it's still easier than sewing it on after the bear is finished. Also, like the fish, it helps to decide ahead of time where you want to stuff the bear. I'm going to stuff mine from the top of its head, because it seems easier, and that way I can make sure I get the legs and paws evenly stuffed. So I'm going to start my stitches here, just below the ear. And we're back to the brown thread. To start, go in through only one side of the bear to hide that knot in the middle. Yes, the eyes are a pain to work around, which is why I wish the pointy parts were shorter, but I promise it will all come together in the end. Anyway, take your needle and run it over the edge of the bear and come back through the initial hole. Do that again, but this time run the needle through the loop of the thread. I accidentally tightened the thread too much and had to pull the loop back out, and that happens sometimes. But now the first stitch is done, and we can work our way around the bear the same way we did the fish. Needle goes in one side, comes out the other, through the loop, pull the thread tight, and repeat. When you get to the paw with the fish, just ignore the fish. Work around it, preferably without catching the fish in any of your stitches. You will notice that if there are places where the two sides don't match up perfectly, the stitches help to correct it. The thread tightens them together to the same length, and the blanket stitch helps conceal the places where the fabric bubbles up or wrinkles. When you run out of thread, just tie it off, get some more thread, and start over again where you left off. Honestly, it's probably easier to go through several rounds of replacing thread than have one very long stretch of thread that constantly gets tangled. I'm now at the point opposite from where I started, so it's time to stuff the bear. Since I didn't tie off the thread like I did with the fish, I'm just going to let the needle and thread dangle from where I left off. They'll be fine. If the last stitch or two comes loose, it's easy to tug on the thread to tighten them back up again. As we did with the fish, add the polyfill a little bit at a time. Feel free to use whatever utensils are at your disposal to help push the stuffing to the bottom or into the smaller crevices like the legs and paws. But make sure you aren't too enthusiastic with the jabbing and accidentally poke your scissors or whatever through the fabric or the sewn up edges. Add as much or as little polyfill as you want. Maybe your bear has just emerged in the spring and has burned off all of their hibernation fat. Or maybe your bear is prepping for Fat Bear Week and wants your vote as the chonkiest of them all. The only thing to keep in mind is that the more overstuffed your bear is, the more challenging it will be to sew up the last little bit. You'll constantly have to push the stuffing down so it doesn't get in the way of your stitches. My advice is to add enough that when you push the stuffing down from the open part of the bear, it feels too full for your liking. That way, when you finish sewing them up, you can squish the bear around and redistribute the stuffing to make it just right. You'll also notice that the addition of the stuffing fills in the gaps around the long pointy eyes, making it look and feel less weird. When you get to the ribbon with a keychain, there's nothing special you need to do since it should already be glued or sewn in place. You can just skip your stitch right over it, or if you want to make it extra secure, you can sew right through it. I decided to put a stitch through the middle of it, and while it got a little confusing to maneuver the ribbon and the keychain around the loops of the blanket stitch, it ended up looking just fine. And finally, back to where I started, I'm going to thread my needle through the first stitch and tie it off. Despite my best intentions to make a small, discreet knot, the thread decided to throw out a messy loop. I tried to tie the loop into a knot deeper between the two layers of felt. That did not work, so I pulled out the needle to try to poke it in place, which also didn't work. But I also don't care enough to try to undo or redo any knots, so I'm just going to cut off the loop. It wasn't part of the knot holding the stitches together, so I'm not losing any structural integrity. It just leaves a bit of an eyesore with the loose end sticking out. Whatever. Time for final inspection. Squish the stuffing around, scooch any odd stitches into place, pluck out loose tendrils of polyfill, but that's it. You are now the proud mama or papa bear to a fat bear Feltie. I think I'm going to name mine Otis in honor of my personal favorite fat bear. What are you going to name yours? Anyway, thanks for watching this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. Be sure to stop by the York Public Library to pick up a kit to make these Felties. They will be available throughout the month of October. You can also check out what else we have going on at the library at yclibrary.org. And even though it's too late to vote in this year's Fat Bear Week, look it up anyway, watch the live cams, and get excited for next year's Fat Bears. Go! Go watch them now! Like, now. Bye!